Okay. Very good morning to you all. Just a few words on the program of the day. The three following roundtables are setting up within the framework of the Paris Defense Young Leaders Program, organized by ISM. In other words, we are welcoming today our young leaders as guest speakers. This is one of the highlights of the program, and the idea is to get the young leaders talking about three themes today: securitization of the world, governance in crisis, and polarization of the world. Our speakers can either challenge these themes or agree with them. The speakers will present their argument with concrete cases drawn from their research and expertise in their respective fields. So thank you for attending this first roundtable on securitization, moderated by Eric Sangar. Eric, you will introduce our guest speakers, but first of all, let me introduce you. So Eric Sangar is an assistant professor in political science at Sciences Po Lille and an associate member of the Marc Bloch Center in Berlin. Prior to his arrival in Lille in 2018, he worked in various positions at European research institutions, including as a FNRS research fellow based at the University of Namur, Belgium, as a research associate at King's College, London, as part of the EU project Infocore, and as a Fernand Braudel postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Strategic Research, so IRSEM. His research agenda focuses on the links between collective memory and the uses of history in foreign policy and conflict discourse. He also analyzes the role of emotions in the justification of violence, as well as diffusion processes in Franco-German relations. So, Eric, I know that you have many projects under review now, but I can just mention one of your latest publications. So you co-authored with Anne Bazin and Valérie Roseau and also other colleagues a book which is entitled Memory Fragmentation from Below and Beyond the State. So the floor is yours. Enjoy.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thank you, first of all, to IRSEM and Wendy for inviting me here to facilitate our discussion. So I will try not to talk too much, because really you should be at the center of this first event. Let me just introduce the four members of our first panel this morning, and you will see they have very different profiles, but all very exciting profiles. So I think we will actually have difficulties keeping ourselves to the time that we have this morning. So I will start on my left with Professor Nina Willen. So she's a research director at for the Africa program at the Agman Institute for International Relations, and also an associate professor at the Department of Political Science at Lund University in Sweden. She focuses mainly on military intervention and armed conflicts, including security force assistance and peacekeeping operations in Africa mainly. So you have done field work in the Sahel and Great Lakes region and have already published in a lot of high-ranking journals, including International Affairs, European Journal of International Security, and Armed Forces and Society. You were a member of many different policy panels. You contributed to the Belgium's first national security strategy, and you were also one of the experts in the Strategic Committee on Defense in Belgium in 2021. You are also participating in expert panels for NATO. You are a member of different academies, so I'm not going to list all your different functions. Your latest book is called African Peacekeeping, that was published in Cambridge University Press in 2022. And you are now in the process of publishing a new book. It's called Securitizing Sahel, Analyzing External Interventions and Their Consequences. And then if you hear the word securitizing, we know why you're on this panel this morning. Then next on my list is Aaron Vanyan, who is a Russian-Armenian independent researcher, an editor, and also a journalist. You are mainly at the moment working on family memories of former Soviet prisoners of war in Germany, so who died in Germany during the war, during the Second World War. And on that role, in that research, you collaborate with the Memorial Society, but also with German museums and memorial sites, such as the Berlin Karlshorst Museum and the Dresden Documentation Center. You are now in, let's say, exile, or you left Russia after a MA degree at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and so for now you're living in Germany. And your latest book is called, that was published just this year. Sorry, it's an article. It's called "This Was Not Our War." Then on the right to Aaron is Dr. Daniela Pisoiu. She is currently a senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. He's mainly working on terrorism, security politics, extremism, and radicalization, and mainly Islamist radicalization, if I see it correctly. Also right wing. Okay, so all types of almost all types of radicalization. In her PhD, she was interested in the causes and processes of Islamist radicalization in Western Europe. She was a US Fulbright fellow at the University of Cincinnati, but she's also a graduate of the University of Vienna and the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. She has already published a number of different articles and books. Among her latest article is a one that's called "Doing It Again, Assessing the Features and Implications of Terrorist Recidivism in the Context of Jihadi Attacks in Europe." So why do people actually commit attacks again? Why are they not having enough? And she also coordinates at the moment an EU-funded project that's called Participatory Approaches to Protecting Places of Worship. Then, last but not least, on your right is sitting Dr. Bogdana Kurylo. She is currently a fellow in qualitative methodology at the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE. You have received a PhD in International Relations and East European Studies from University College London just this year, I think. And actually, your research is bridging international relations, security studies, but also post-Soviet politics, so domestic politics. And you're looking in how non-traditional actors, security actors, transform security discourses. So I think I've understood you're really interested in civil society actors, mainly in Ukraine, and how they influence security discourse. Once again, I think it's a great fit with the panel. So you're also interested in populist discourses and aesthetics of security. You have held various positions, teaching positions at University College London, Queen Mary University, King's College London, and Oxford Brookes University. Her last article is called "The Ukrainian Subjects, Hierarchies of Knowledge Production and the Everyday, an Auto-Ethnographic Narrative," that came out just last year. Okay, great. So I was told that we should be very disciplined with regards to timing, also in a military school, so we should really be, very disciplined. So obviously, this is a very large topic, ongoing securitization. And I think there are three ways of interpreting it. You can say securitization in terms of a proliferation of objective security threats, so wars, proliferating, climate change related threats, radicalization, all the different. But you can also interpret it in a second way, the idea that perceptions of security threats proliferate, the perceptions that, I don't know, our well-being is no longer guaranteed, the perception that, you know, life is becoming less and less predictable. And the third way of interpreting it would be more related to the kind of more narrow concept of securitization developed by the Copenhagen School, so securitization as a discursive process through which issues are becoming constructed as existential threats, and through that process extraordinary measures, sometimes even extra-constitutional measures are legitimized. So those are three ways of interpreting that. We'll see to what extent you can maybe react to one or the other, but it's obviously just an offer. So I would say we proceed in the order of the program. We start with Nina. She will have 5 minutes to just present a short statement based on her own research. Then we do the same for Aaron, Daniela, and Fortana, sorry. And we then have a small debate in the panel, and then open the floor to the audience. Yeah, you're supposed to.
So I thought I'd make this easier for myself and hopefully more interesting, because I know my own topics better than others. So I thought I'd just give you the pitch of the book, Securitizing the Sahel, analyzing external interventions, and also because I'm in the military school in France, and France has been one of the main actors in the Sahel, of course. And I'm going to focus those 5 minutes on 3 points. The first one is securitization, the second is militarization, and the third one is the military coups. And as some of you are following what's happening in the region, you also can see that this is a bit of a chronological order of what has happened. So starting with securitization, the Sahel is a region which, as many of you know, has been in the center of attention, especially for EU and France, for more than 10 years now. I would argue that it has already gone back, almost 20 years back, when the Sahel started becoming a region that attracted attention because of its ungoverned spaces. This is really the concept that comes back over and over again in different policy documents, and also, of course, in the US strategy, security strategy from 2002, and the EU strategy later on, as Sahel being one of those areas that could harbor terrorist threats. And today, 20 years later, we can say, well, actually those predictions were right. But I think that the securitization of the Sahel really started its increase in 2011, 2012, when there was an implosion in Mali, when there was sort of an unholy alliance between rebel actors and jihadists that made an incursion towards central Mali, which then resulted in several different external military interventions. Of course, France was one of the driving forces to intervene and prevent the jihadis from taking over Mali. But it wasn't just France, it was several different external actors who answered or who acted upon this securitization of the Sahel by providing military assistance to several different national and local actors in the region. And this is where I come to the second point, the militarization, that this became somehow the primary perspective through which the Sahel crisis, and there's not just one, there's several, but it became the perspective through which the crisis in the Sahel was supposed to be resolved. And that was not just external actors that pushed for that type of interpretation, but also national elite actors, national military actors who took benefit of this type of militarization. And the way that I've analyzed this in the book is the different types of security force assistance that has been given, both through Operation Barkhane, so the large counterterrorism operation that France launched, but also through MINUSMA, the UN mission, also launched in Mali, and through many of the bilateral different military collaboration, and of course through the EU CSDP operations. We've had 3, actually 4, the 4th one never really got off to a start in Niger, EU CSDP operations to try to increase the capacities of the security forces and then decrease the capacities of the non-state armed actors. And I think that this approach, whereas I'm not criticizing it completely, because I do think that there was a need for this, it took over. It took over the way that the Sahel crisis were seen by both internal and external actors, and it has led to a militarization of the region and the way that the different actors are acting. And I think that it contributed to a civil-military imbalance, whereby the military actors got more power than the civilian actors, where the military interlocutors and security actors that were in constant contact with the external actors suddenly had an influence that was much heavier than their civilian counterparts. And this is, of course, not something new. The Sahel is a region where the civil-military imbalance has been historical, but I think that the last 10 years has really increased that. And that resulted in my last point, which is the latest military wave of coups d'etats, so military coups. And during the past 4 years, we've seen 16 coup attempts in the Sahel, in Africa more broadly, 9 successful coups, and 6 of those coups have taken place in the Sahel. And I'm arguing then that this civil-military balance has reached its peak with this with these new wave of coups. And I'm at 4:55, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nina. So I think that was already a very interesting insight, the idea that securitization actually does not necessarily lead to more security. It can actually, at least maybe more security for some actors, but maybe less security for others. Thank you. Let's listen to Aaron.
Yeah. I'm going to talk about, I will say, not usual case of securitization, but this case has interested me since I started living and working in Germany. It's about securitization of memory, or to be more precise, a case where securitization of memory did not happen. As I'm going to speak about memory, I would like to make a very brief historical remark. During World War II, tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war died in camps across Germany. But in the Soviet Union, information about these prisoners of war was classified because the topic of Soviet prisoners of war was taboo, and families of these soldiers, they were misled by Soviet authorities. They were told that these soldiers were missing in action, and this government policy stayed the same until the Soviet Union collapsed. Things began to change in the 21st century. In 2000, German government started a joint project with the Russian government. Project focused on commemorating Soviet POWs who died in German camps. For almost 15 years, German and Russian officials and historians, they worked together on finding and collecting archive materials dedicated to Soviet prisoners of war, digitize them, and create, this was the most important thing, they created online database about these Soviet prisoners of war. So only in the 21st century, family members of these Soviet soldiers, they find out for the first time that these soldiers were not missing in action, as Soviet authorities told them during 50 years. That in real, they were prisoners of war and died in Germany. But in 2014, things began to change again, because what? Because Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea, and Germany had to reduce its role and participants in this joint project. Russia, meanwhile, took over the project and removed all information about German participants, German participation, German historians, etc., and replaced by their historical military propaganda materials. For example, if you visit today this online database about Soviet POWs, you will find advertisements of Russian armed forces urging you to join Russian military. Yeah. Good question why this failure happened with this project. Yes, this very promising project. And in my opinion, one of the reasons why this happened, because German officials and historians, they worked only with Russian side. They excluded all other post-Soviet countries and worked once again only with Russian experts, Russian institutions such as Russian Ministry of Defense, and only with Russian-speaking audience. Once again, there was Soviet soldiers, not Russian. But this is what happened, yeah. And I found it possible to say, unfortunately, that this policy of German memory institutions, they helped to spread in this almost 15 years very important and general idea of Russian propaganda for over 20 years, that Russia is the only successor of Soviet Union, that Russia owns Soviet heritage, not only main Soviet language, but also Soviet historical memory. And also, what is most important, relations that Soviet Union had with its neighbors, with Soviet and socialist countries such as Ukraine or Germany. And and this propaganda, Russian propaganda, historical spreads abroad too, also in Germany. And just an example, there was state elections in Germany in 2024 in Eastern Germany, and the best results showed far right and far left parties, very pro-Russian parties, which repeat with basic, with general Russian propaganda idea that Russia should have the same peaceful relations with their neighbors. For example, Germany and Russia should have the same relations as Soviet Union and GDR had. So this is the reason why Germany, at least Eastern Germany, should not support Ukraine, because for Eastern Germans, peaceful coexistence with Russia is more important than anything that can happen with Ukraine. And this is just an example how this very promising project initiated 25 years ago finished with failure, totally failure from German side, in my opinion. And maybe it is just an example of lack of securitization of memory.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Erwin. And I think we understood that from your intervention that it's not only contemporary issues that are securitized sometimes, but it's also, and maybe more importantly, the past and representations of the past that are selectively becoming transmitted, highlighted as important, or maybe not selected or de-emphasized, often based on, I would say, contemporary security interests. You talked about both Germany and contemporary Russia jointly deciding, okay, we need to emphasize some aspects of the story of prisoners of war, neglecting, marginalizing other post-Soviet countries. And obviously today this joint enterprise has come to an end because of the invasion. Yeah, thank you, Erwin. Let's listen to Daniela.
Thank you so much. Also for the introduction, and as you said, my work is on radicalization, terrorism, and also counterterrorism policies. I think I'm going to address briefly the first and the third dimension that you mentioned in terms of securitization. I was actually planning on the third, but the first is also interesting. Wars proliferating. So I don't know if it's already very well known, but I'm going to say it anyway. Especially concerning Islamist radicalization. Recently, it has been in connection to conflicts. So we had this huge wave, you guys obviously remember, connected to the war in Syria when Daesh or the Islamic State emerged and basically led to a huge development of Salafi and jihadi scenes in Europe, for example, in Austria, where before that it was basically almost non-existent. And we're going to have a second wave now with the war in Gaza. And my argument is usually that is going to be worse. Why? Not necessarily because people can travel, they cannot travel to Palestine, but that's one of the reasons why it makes it worse, because the message of the Islamic State is to say you have to do attacks in Europe. So this is basically the ideological message there. This conflict is also a lot closer to Europe than the other one. There's a lot of sympathy, of course, beyond the Salafi and the jihadi scene. And thirdly, sometimes we have very unhelpful foreign policies. Not necessarily France, but for sure Germany and Austria, where there's a very one-sided approach to the conflict, and even the one or the other deliveries of weapons, which makes everything, of course, a lot worse and very easily to instrumentalize in the propaganda. Now, concerning the third dimension, which you mentioned, with the classical Copenhagen School approach to say that, we put things into the area of security that actually don't belong there. And here, actually, we developed in the German-speaking world of radicalization research even a concept which is called co-radicalization. And it refers to measures taken by the state to fight radicalization, but which actually contribute to more radicalization. And this is also very well connected to the social movement theory on how terrorism emerges, where the state, the actions of the state are very important. So in this particular literature, one doesn't just look at the actors themselves, but also the process, the interaction, and in particular what the state does. So just to give you some examples, in terms of Islamist radicalization, obviously, there was a clear securitization of Islam and migration. It was basically externalized as being something new, exceptional, although, of course, Europe had so much experience already with terrorism of various kinds, left-wing terrorism, ethno-nationalist terrorism. But as soon as jihadi terrorism emerged, people thought, oh, there's something new, we have to find new explanations. And the first thing to do was to look at the Muslim community and see, oh, what is so interesting about or different about the Muslims? Trying to basically find explanations in features of a broader community. So this is a very clear example of securitization. Things that, first it started with, Islam as a religion, and then economic indicators, educational indicators, culture, and so forth. What led to something else, which is another concept in the literature called suspect communities, right? So, assuming that some communities are vulnerable to radicalization, and we'll know, sooner or later, something will emerge from there. Now, what is the problem, apart from, ethical and scientific problems? It's very counterproductive in a pragmatic way, because basically it leads to more radicalization. How? At least in two ways. First of all, it confirms the propaganda of the extremists themselves, who say that, Europe doesn't like Muslims, discriminates them, and so forth. And also, in a second way, it prevents, obviously, communities from participating in prevention efforts, because there is a lack of trust, clearly, between them and the government. Another way of securitization, which is done not by the state, but by an extremist actor, is what's going on in the far-right spectrum, where, of course, migration is also securitized and it's portrayed as a, big danger. And the problem is that this is done in collusion with very skilled professionals working on various social media. So the portraying of this phenomenon is very convincing, very scary, hyperbolized with, images of masses of young black people about to invade Europe. So this has become, it's been artificially created fear that now is in the top fears of Europeans all over the place. And here, just to finish, because my time is running out, what is also contributing to is what I call, what we have a project on, it's very important, I think, to mention, it's called identity framing. So basically what the far right is doing now very well, especially on TikTok, is to basically differentiate between, the real whatever, French, Germans, Austrians, and the others. And this has gone in the meantime beyond migration. So the other is everybody else who is not traditional, who's not straight, who is progressive. And this is basically just announcing the next panel. It's so much contributing to this polarization. And I think we have to look at this a lot more from the perspective of the strategic actor rather than as a given. Society is not given polarized, but there are actors who are really pushing this in a very professional way. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Great. I think we kind of saw maybe kind of a similar process than the process Nina told us about, although obviously a very different context, because you showed us that policies that are aiming, or at least officially aiming at combating security problems and threats, actually may produce the opposite, may actually contribute to reinforce threats, or at least divisions, societal divisions, but also radicalization itself. So I think that's already a very important point of this panel, that at actually security policies, that the fact that there's an institutional reaction to a threat, or at least to a perceived threat, it's not actually always productive. Maybe it's counterproductive. And I think that's something that Nina told us as well. Okay, let's listen then to Bordana, sorry. Maybe at the end of the panel I will know your name. And let's listen to your 5 minutes, then we enter the discussion.
Okay, thank you. So today I wanted to contextualize today's topic within the politics of knowledge production on Russia's war against Ukraine within academia itself. So maybe that would be of some interest to folks here who are outside of academia. And this context reveals the two crucial questions in international security studies. So first of all, who has the authority to speak about security, and whose voices are privileged in these conversations? In particular, I'll argue that within international security studies, there has been a certain attempt at desecuritizing Russia's war against Ukraine, which is paradoxical in a way, and which contributes to the marginalization of Ukrainian voices on the global scale. So, of course, some of you might be well aware that there are some realist scholars, in particular John Mearsheimer, who has argued that, in fact, it's NATO's expansion into the Eastern Europe that Russia perceives as a threat, and that is the cause of the war. So in a way, that the projector here was pointed towards the West as being the central actor and the central threat, not Russia. But we see a certain parallel with the discourses promoted by some critical security scholars. In particular, Ole Weaver, one of the founders of securitization theory, in his interview to a Danish newspaper, he actually criticized NATO for characterizing Russia as a threat to global peace, arguing that this creates a polarizing democracy versus autocracy narrative that allegedly provokes Russia's belligerence. And similarly, we have seen a number of feminist scholars and activists writing anti-war manifestos, the notorious manifestos, that while claiming to stand in solidarity with Ukraine, have opposed providing military aid and suggested that it promotes militarization and risks authoritarian outcomes, very much drawing upon the theoretical risks that are associated with securitization processes. So these positions, while presented as peace-promoting, effectively deny Ukrainians agency in our own defense, I must speak as a Ukrainian, against Russian aggression, and ignore our fundamental right of self-defense against an imperial aggressor. And the argument that Western actions provoked the conflict ignores the fact that it was the West's hesitancy and weakness that, particularly following Russia's initial aggression in 2014, that enabled war's escalation nowadays. This misreading of cause and effect can be quite dangerous. And I believe that a more nuanced understanding can come from foregrounding Ukrainian agency and voices beyond President Zelensky's high-profile role. We should also look into the agency of Ukrainian civil society and the concrete material actions that Ukrainian civilians and citizens have taken to stop Russia's aggression. And Ukrainians are very much at the forefront of asserting Russia as an existential threat, not only to Ukraine's national survival and democratic aspirations, but also to the international rules-based order as a whole. The marginalization of Ukrainian voices reflects broader power structures and power hierarchies in the global production of security knowledge that privilege Western interpretations over those from Central and Eastern Europe. So that's something we also have to attend to. And there is a degree of parochialism in this because it reduces the understanding of the war to a narrow self-referential viewpoint, ignoring the first-hand experience of those who actually deal with Russia's imperialism. And it's not just morally problematic, it's also pragmatically dangerous. So viewing Russian aggression as merely a threat to those distant Ukrainians obscures the consequences of Russian aggression for international security, democratic values, and the post-war order globally. And so the problem of Russian imperialist expansionism is unlikely to go away just because you desecuritize it and present it as less of a threat. On a more positive side, however, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has catalyzed a significant shift in the hierarchies of who gets to speak about security and therefore whose security matters. Ukrainians are increasingly asserting our authority in security debates, demanding the adherence to the principle of nothing about us without us. And this extends beyond academic discourse to practical policy discussions about peace initiatives and international support. So my core message is clear. Any meaningful discussion of security in the context of this war must center Ukrainian perspectives. The struggle isn't just military. It's also about who gets to shape the narrative and determine solutions. And the struggle for Ukraine's right to tell its own story cannot be separated from our fight for survival and self-determination. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bohdana, for your intervention. And maybe we can see here parallel to Aaron's. I think we can keep it for the moment. Because you say it is important to look who is speaking about security, whose interests, so maybe not only interests in terms of hard security interests, but maybe also scholarly interests, orientations. So who's speaking on behalf of whom, who's justifying what type of security discourse, and you say obviously this has very real implications, small implications, political implications, and you speak maybe like Aaron also about maybe not the problems or dangers of desecuritizing something or not taking something as serious enough. So that would be maybe a contrast point to what Daniela and Nina were saying. So maybe not taking enough what Ukrainian society, Ukrainian civil society says about the Russian invasion, how important that war is. It's maybe not just about some square kilometers of territory, but maybe it's about really a discussion we had before about the ontological security of Ukrainian society. And so maybe less securitization here is maybe dangerous. So this is maybe a good point to start a discussion. Obviously you feel free to react to anyone, but maybe let's start with that, because that's also maybe a challenge for any scholar of security, is to kind of, okay, we are aware that securitization can be problematic, as Daniela said, as Nina said, it's maybe excluding other policy options, highlighting or legitimizing some actors more than others, legitimizing some reaction, often violent reactions more than others. Maybe increasing polarization because this contributes to binary perceptions. But on the other hand, if security needs, material needs, but maybe also psychological needs, social needs are not taken seriously enough, and this maybe even apply to even the biggest security challenge of all, which is climate change. If we don't securitize, for example, climate change, maybe this will result in our society collapsing, not such a far distant future. So my question would be, how do we deal with that? How do we know, and how do we maybe also write about it, research about it, how do we know to what extent, what security issues really matter in terms of, what we should criticize, but what we should, and on the other hand, what we should legitimize. Do we have to look at the actors? Is it, maybe we should be more careful to security discourses by marginalized actors, by actors that cannot be heard as easily as others? Or is it about implications? What policy are justified by securitization? Do we have to look at, what are the policies that result from that? So this would be just a starting.
Yeah, maybe if I can just briefly start. So I think the question is, you can say it this way, perhaps not a securitization, yes or no, but of what? At least in my field, this is the main question. Because, so my argument was to say, first of all, it was securitization of the wrong thing. In terms of state policy, you should have, looked at other aspects. And then if you look at the far right, and I want to build on what Bogdana just said, because I think, this is exactly also what the far right is actively doing. Basically, not securitizing the conflict in Ukraine, but basically saying that, it goes as far as to say there is no war. What do you mean? Have you been there? Have you seen it? There is no war. Yeah, so you have these conspiracy theories going on, there is no war. Or to say, well, basically just reproducing the Russian propaganda and say or it's not our thing, why should we be worried about that's their thing? And then it goes also into financial arguments saying, well, actually it makes us poor because we have to support all this war effort. We shouldn't do that. Why should we do that? So basically taking this extremely important aspect of security nowadays, trying to get it out of the security discourse and putting something else in it, which is the migrants and the others. And see, so basically this is a very shrewd strategy that unfortunately works very well, to the question of what is being securitized. And then maybe just to finish up, a very short point is, we don't always have to securitize things, even if it's a security issue. So the question is in terms of policy. So for example, if you want to address radicalization, maybe it's not security policy and security agencies the best actors to deal with this. Maybe you should invest more in prevention, in social policies, educational policies, so outside the security area of the actual measure, even if the threat is in the security area.
Thank you, Daniela. I think, Bogdana, and then
Okay.
Then Nina.
Thank you. So, very interesting question. Thank you very much. And I agree that not all securitizations are morally equal. And what is important is trying to distinguish between different securitization processes based on who benefits, right? And there is no objective way of doing it. There is no secret that I might tell you about this. And the category of the marginalized is problematic in itself because different factions within society will try to reclaim that category for itself. But what I can tell you is that by removing issue out of this extraordinary realm of security, we might deprive, or we most certainly will deprive it of the necessary level of attention that it deserves. So we must be clear about, here are values. Yes, they are very likely to be situated and contextually bounded, but that's okay. We'll fight for our values, our definitions. And I think that what's important is recognizing that security is very much a contextual phenomenon, and there is nothing inherently bad or good about securitization. We just have to use our common sense, I would say, and have a common agreement on what's right or wrong based on our values. And it's totally, I totally recognize the fact that there are some far-right groups will have different values to our values. And therefore, this contestation in the realm of security is very much natural. For me, securitization is not about creating something fake, like security as a fake concept. Of course, it's socially constructed, but what implies is that there is this constant political contestation over what is right or wrong, over who benefits and who deserves to benefit. So as long as we are clear about it and accepting of that fact, I think we will then be more open to disagreement.
Thank you. Nina?
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on 2 points that Daniela and Fontana said. The first one was about the securitization and how that often leads to focus. And I think the suspect communities that you mentioned is really the case also from African perspective, that the migration has become the securitizing discourse has, instead of focusing on the actual problems on the ground, it has become about Europe's security. So whose security are we talking about? Are we talking about Europe's security? Or are we talking about the people in the Sahel security? And then the focus has been on Europe's security, and the suspect communities have been migration, even though migration from the Sahel countries is extremely low. I mean, the figures are ridiculous. These are transit countries, but that has become the focus for the policy debates, and it has been picked up by right-wing and populist discourses to make this into something that it's not, right? And I think that that's also tying in to your point about who is allowed to speak and whose voices are heard. Migration in certain areas of the Sahel is nothing. It has not been connected to radicalization. It has not been connected to terrorism until in the recent years, when it has also been securitized, like the mobility over borders have been securitized as a risk. So I think that this sort of it's almost like it's turned on its head, the whole idea of migration and securitization and radicalization. And then the objective becomes something different and not necessarily a productive solution to it. And you can also see that the co-radicalization that you talked about is also really relevant in that regards, because when you, I'm not saying that it's completely wrong, but when you train security forces and that they commit violence against these suspect communities, well, then you are increasing jihadist recruitment in these areas. So it becomes a vicious circle of violence. I had 2 questions for my fellow panelists. So I was wondering for Aaron, super interesting, of course, but you are saying that Germany only worked with Russian experts instead of working with others. But I mean, is the blame on Germany then? Or isn't the blame like... You say, okay, it's a failure, but the major failure is from Russia trying to take over and appropriating this process, right? And then, so is there any way that, apart from having worked with other experts, is there any way that could have been prevented? And also, what are the effects of this dissemination of the Russian propaganda today? Like, what is it actually having any impact? And then I have a question also for about Ukraine and about the voices that are heard. I know that in the UK, because I have a colleague, Ksenia Oksamitna, that you might know, who has also been writing quite a lot about how Ukrainian voices are not discriminated, but they're put a bit to the side of the whole discussion about the Russian war, and how suddenly, but at the same time, at every panel and every conference I've been to on security, now it's become a thing to invite one Ukrainian speaker to represent Ukraine, which I also find quite disturbing, because it's not just because you're Ukrainian that you're capable of analyzing the conflict from an academic perspective. Same, and we can apply that to any other area. We also have to always invite a Sahelian researcher to analyze what's happening in Sahel. But what happens is often that you invite somebody who can get a passport or a visa, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that person has... So I think this question of who is allowed to speak about what has also to... It implies a huge conversation about knowledge production yes, about the right and the wrongs about speaking up.
So maybe Erwin and then
Thank you for questions, Nina. Yeah. Why I say that failure was first German side, because just an example, there is a former prisoner of war camp in Zeithain. It's a small city in eastern Germany. During World War II, around 25,000 Soviet soldiers died in this camp, and every fifth soldier was Ukrainian. So if any Ukrainian family wants to find out what happened to their family members, they have to know Russian, and they have to visit online these websites, which are now running by Russian Ministry of Defense, you know? Yeah. So like this is the only way how you can right now in post-Soviet countries find out what happened to your ancestors who were missing in action, who died as prisoners of war. This is just an example why like other languages, at least like Ukraine, because Ukraine was first country where Germany invaded Soviet Union territories, you know. So just an example, yeah. Second, implications of this project, like in 2024 state elections in Eastern Germany, new radical left-wing party Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance showed very good results, and this party is absolutely pro-Russian, and they use this argument that modern Germany, at least Eastern Germany, should have the same relations with Russia as Soviet Union had with GDR, and they use this thing that in Germany they called it nostalgia, the nostalgic feelings for the past, for the GDR era, you know. So this is like just an example, and this project that Germany had with Russia, it's always about, I will say, romanticization, thank you, of Russia as a Soviet successor, you know. Like it was a very basic like impression from my side, for example, at least because a person with a very strong post-Soviet background. This was just I hope I answered your questions.
You did.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So you're right, there has been a lot of progress being made within academic and policy circles, in the sense that there is now always a token Ukrainian sitting in the events dedicated to the war. But anyway, progress has been made, and that's largely thanks to the struggle that we Ukrainian academics, Ukrainian and other East European academics in the West have united and decided to stick together in asserting our voice and disrupting events that are not inclusive of Ukrainians. But at the same time, what you asked also raises a key problem here, because this one Ukrainian in those events assumes a huge responsibility to speak suddenly for all Ukrainians, as if that's somehow homogeneous categories that we can just easily comprehend and represent the voice of. And I must also recognize the fact that to some extent I come from an elite Western academic circle, so I'm not Ukrainian just like other Ukrainians, but I already have a certain privilege to be in the West despite my family being in Ukraine. And in my study of Ukrainian society, I do my best to represent a range of groups and a range of voices within Ukrainian society, but at the same time I'm aware of my political role in giving voice to some and possibly denying it to others. So there is nothing really fundamentally objective in this, but we are doing our best to respond to those different demands within Ukrainian society. And at the moment, I must say that there is certain unity within Ukraine as to what kind of future we want and our stance towards Russia. But as the time goes on, there could be more polarization, which is the theme of our next roundtable, and things will change then. But for now, these are the main challenges that we face.
Thank you to you too. I'm just asking. So, how much longer can we, you know, half an hour? may I ask two more questions, and then so yeah, I have to respect here the chain of command. I had one specific question to Nina, and maybe a more general question to the three of you, but because you mentioned in the beginning of your statement the idea of ungoverned spaces, the idea that in Sahel, I've worked on Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, there was the same discourse. It's an ungoverned space. We have to kind of bring security institutions there. Would you say, I mean, are we still in a world, despite all the discourse about failed intervention, are we still in a world where we think the model of the Western state should be applied anywhere? Are we, from your research, do you still think it's about exporting the European nation state to the Sahel, or are we past that? Are we now something more hybrid? Are we finally accepting that different society had different ways of governing themselves? So that would be the specific question to you. I think all three of you, you kind of say security, what is security, how it should be protected. Those decisions are being made by actors who are not always the most qualified, the most legitimate, or at least don't always have the best insights. So my question would be, how can we change it? How can we democratize security discourses? Well, because you could say, well, we can have, I don't know, citizen assemblies. I know that Extinction Rebellion is doing that. So I'm talking about the example when I'm teaching security theories of security. But then we have obviously the example of social networks where it can actually go very, very, in ways that maybe are not desirable, at least for someone attached to democracy. So how can we open up security discourse without falling into the trap of, I don't know, or without, by still while being attached to something like some democratic way of decision making. I don't know if this is very clear, but yeah. Maybe Nina first, and then if you have any one of you have an idea, and then we open up.
I think I just want to make clear that I do, just to reconnect to what we spoke about before, I do think it's important to have voices from everyone, and I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have that. I just think that we also need to reflect on that. We can't assume that it's always like that with discriminated groups. Like when we have panels and there's one woman, she's supposed to represent every woman. And if we have one person with a different skin color, that person is supposed to represent all of Africa, for example. And I think that's very problematic to put that responsibility and that burden on that person that needs to have this token representation. But that's not to say that I don't think that we should have a larger variety and diversity of voices in all types of discussion. So now I'm coming to your question, Eric. Ungoverned spaces and the model Western state. I don't know if it has been really a clear objective from the external interveners in the Sahel to create some sort of Western model state. I think the idea was always to combat jihadism and then to control the borders for migration outwards. And that, of course, resembles somewhat to a state, the control, the authority of a territory. But apart from that, hasn't been that much effort. It's been extending state authority, but it hasn't really been about governance, which is at the heart of and governance is such a fluffy concept, but there hasn't been, it's so sensitive to talk about governance in these states. And I think there hasn't been enough efforts from the national and local actors as well to buy in to actually taking responsibility to give basic services to its citizens. And then the external actors have bought into the security discourse. So I'm not sure that we can talk about that different societies have different ways of governing themselves in this context. I think that that's true in general, but in the Sahel today, what we're seeing is 3, 4, if we count Chad, military autocracies, and with a huge turn, like authoritarian turn. So it's definitely not the Sahelian population that are now deciding for their own futures. We have military juntas in all 3 states, and in Chad there has been fake elections basically. So I don't know, I think that would be to say, like, this is not the African way. This is militarism and authoritarianism at its worst. And I don't say that this is Western or African or non-Western. This is just the opposite of democracy.
Yeah, I mean, so democratization of, or democratizing decision making in security issues, well, it sounds good, but it can be very dangerous also. Because we have seen, I think, you know, the wake-up call is to see how easily people can be manipulated online. Yeah, so you know, I think that there's an assumption to say, you know, if it's democratic, as in if people decide it's going to be the good decision. Yeah, but it depends on, you know, what information they have, what kind of education they have, especially concerning social media. So I think, you know, you have different kinds of decision-making processes. This is not necessarily the issue. The issue is, in general, for each case, information. Are the people informed? Are they educated in terms of, you know, how to use social media? So I think this is what we need to do more, because it's amazing what can happen just, you know, within a few days on TikTok. And the other thing which I think is important is we have to argue more for democracy. I think, you know, there is an assumption that everybody thinks democracy is great, or everybody knows what democracy is. And you'd be surprised if you ask in schools, or if you ask even teachers, what is democracy? The kinds of responses you will get. So, you know, after 50 years or more, I guess, of having this, you know, what we think it's the ideal way of governing, I think we need to start doing some more, you know, I'm going to say a controversial word, propaganda again for democracy.
So I'll briefly situate the topic in relation to what I was talking about, the politics of knowledge production. So first of all, I want to say that there should really be move towards dismantling this monopoly of knowledge that's held by academics, experts, and so on. We should be a little bit more humble because we can't know everything, and very often politics is indeed out of our control. For example, Georgian society rises without asking our permission, and same across the whole world. So politics happen regardless of what we do, and very often, if we don't account for more bottom-up voices, very often we come to realize that we just react to events rather than being on top of them. So I argue that we need to democratize knowledge production, but it could be done through participatory research, events that combine various groups of people, such as to some extent this one, but to also second the point that's been just made, it's important whom we give platform. And as I said before, our values might not be universal, but they're ours, and we have to put some effort into upholding them. So it is important to have some boundaries and not just give platform to whoever breaches our values.
I agree with Daniela that governments should defend democracy, but not only democracy, and in my opinion also their perspective on memory, for example. Like since 2014, I know that this topic, securitization of memory, became popular in post-Soviet countries, in Baltic states, in Georgia, or in Ukraine, and I think that in peaceful times there is no need for government to take care about history and memory. But now, like when you see that your neighbor is so aggressive and he can invade your country at any time, of course you have to defend your not only democracy but only your perspective on memory. And I hope that Western European countries will also take care about it.